Okay, so today I want to talk a little bit about global justice. So what is global justice? Well, in fairness, global justice is a rather vague term that covers a wide swath of different kinds of issues. Immigration, refugees, citizenship rights, human rights, international organizations, international trade, multinational corporations, producer cartels, trade treaties, indigenous rights, foreign aid, colonialism, and secession, just to name a few. And what brings all these things together? Well, two things. One, these are normative issues, that is to say people conceive of them, at least in part, in moral terms, not just in terms of advantage or efficiency. And second, they cross borders. They at least open the question as to whose jurisdiction these issues fall under, and indeed imply that, at least at some level, cooperation might be required in order to fully deal with them. Now, a subset of global justice is global distributive justice. These involve the question of whether there are duties to redistribute wealth or resources or even technology from more advantaged to less advantaged countries. Typically, questions of just war theory fall outside the idea of global justice. I don't think that that's because they're not normative and they're not between countries. It's just that just war theory is an older tradition. It's before anybody ever worried about questions of multinational corporations or indigenous rights. There was an attention to just war theory. So in many ways, just war theory developed in parallel to global justice and prior to global justice. But in some sense, it is theoretically a subset of global justice, but historically, it has not been. Okay, let's talk about some competing approaches. At least three, and there's obviously many more than three, but three major types of approaches to global justice: cosmopolitanism, particularism and nationalism, and contractualism. Cosmopolitanism, as you might already know, is the belief that nationality is generally morally irrelevant to how people should be treated. So where you're born and who your parents were just ought not to matter as to what your rights are and what your duties are. There are practical concerns here, of course, that might affect how cosmopolitanism works out in practice. Of course, if some areas are overly populated or nobody is particularly supportive of the idea of cosmopolitanism, then of course that's going to matter as to how cosmopolitans go about practicing their cosmopolitanism. But one thing that cosmopolitans usually agree on is that they're usually critical of the existing state system. For them, it's largely a system of privilege and disability based on national status. And for that reason, it's something that needs to be modified or, in some extreme forms, abolished. Particularism is the view that there are special obligations that individuals have towards their fellow citizens and that these should receive a certain priority. Now, particularists don't have to deny that there are general obligations to foreigners too, but they do tend to claim that there are special obligations to people nearer to oneself, and that these obligations generally outweigh, except in exigent circumstances, generally outweigh obligations due to one's own fellow citizens. To strangers and foreigners. And finally, we have contractualists. Now, contractualists emphasize the importance of agreements in generating duties between citizens of different countries or their governments, right? So there might be no natural duties between citizens of country A and country B, but if country A and country B have a trade treaty or some other treaty, citizens might acquire duties. And indeed, it goes beyond that, because even if there is no treaty, contractualists might say that the circumstances of international relations suggest that it would be a good idea to create them. So this view is somewhat Hobbesian in the sense that prior to any agreement, you don't have any duties. But once you do have an agreement, then you acquire some duties. And indeed, as we develop an international legal architecture of international law and practice, then individuals and states acquire more and more duties. So these contractualists aren't necessarily resistant to the idea that there are duties across borders, but they tend to think that The duties we have are the ones we agreed to. Okay, so the idea of global justice as a whole is an emerging field. I don't think anybody can really afford to ignore questions raised by global justice, even if you don't feel like you are particularly tapped into a network of international relations. A lot of these things will affect you whether you think they will or not. Questions of global warming, species extinction, financial market volatility, including financial contagion across countries, questions of resource scarcity, depletion, and management, global pandemics that have to do with, of course, diseases, not to mention terrorism and human trafficking. Much of what affects our well-being and freedom is going on in other countries, and so it's very much in our interest to develop morally defensible frameworks for dealing with them. Okay, from global justice, let's narrow down to the more specific question of global distributive justice. We can break down global justice into questions of, say, immigration and exclusion, questions of secession, questions of trafficking, for example, questions of foreign aid, right? All of these things have to do with global justice, of course, but global distributive justice is a little bit more specific. Distributive justice considers the question of whether affluent or resource-abundant countries have an obligation founded on justice to share their wealth with the less affluent. Now, even the question is tricky because it requires us to clearly distinguish duties of charity, which are usually understood as optional, from duties of justice, which are usually understood as mandatory. There are several ways of putting this, but at least at the first pass we can distinguish the question of moral duties, which are binding on our conscience, and legal duties, which come attached to threats of legal sanction. Indeed, we can even increase the number of questions we ask by becoming more and more precise, right? We could ask, for instance, whether it would be good, all else being equal, for those who have more to transfer to those who have less in the world. We could also ask, is it morally mandatory for those who have more to transfer to those who have less in the world? Now, note the distinction between these two questions, right? One, would it be good? Two, would it be mandatory? There's many things that it would be good for me to do that I'm not morally obligated to do, right? It might be good of me to help a little old lady cross the street, but there's going to be a separate question whether it's mandatory that I do it if someone else is already helping her, for example. And even if someone is not helping her, it's not clear why I should be the one to which this duty is directed. So the question of whether something would be good to do and whether something is morally mandatory to do are going to be distinct questions. On top of moral questions, we have questions about whether our morality should be enshrined into law or not. There are times when we want our law to reflect our moral convictions, but of course there's also times when law has nothing to do with our moral convictions. They're just pragmatic, like which side of the road we should drive on. And then there's other times when, even though questions are properly moral, we're hesitant to say that the law is a good place to enforce that moral law, or that the law is a good place to enshrine these kinds of moral convictions, either because the legal process is imprecise or messy or costly, or because by making something a legal duty, it in some sense cheapens that duty. Perhaps there are some things that are best done voluntarily on one's own. Okay, so that brings us to the question of whether it should be legally mandatory for those who have more to transfer to those who have less in the world. And again, it's a third type of question that concerns distributive justice, but approaches it in a different sort of way. And of course, for those who answer yes to the third question, they're obviously more strongly committed to global distributive justice to those who answer no to the first question. Okay, we can do some further clarificatory work by exploring the differences between consequentialists and those who are more deontological in their thinking. Now, consequentialists are usually primarily concerned with happiness and suffering. What matters on their view is to relieve suffering and promote well-being, right? The essence of morality, in some sense, is to avoid suffering and promote well-being. So what's right and wrong derives from what would do the most good or evil, right? So specify our global duties to the point where it maximizes the total amount of good done and minimizes the total amount of harm. Deontological thinking, on the other hand, is concerned primarily with right and wrong. What matters on their view is whether the agent, in the context of global justice, that would be a donor, has a duty, or whether a patient, in the global context this would be the recipient, has a right. Because the concern is for appropriate treatment rather than results, questions about the effectiveness of things like aid or intervention are secondary to the question of whether aid or intervention constitutes appropriate treatment. The question is how should we treat people? And there's a right and a wrong way to treat people, and if we have treated somebody in the past in a certain way, then that requires certain things of us today, and so on and so forth. Let's look at some possible deontological views here. Let me make sure, yes, that's right. Some possible deontological views. We could approach these deontological views from the point of view of remedial rights. And note that these things aren't mutually exclusive. I'm just talking about different ways and different reasons we could advance for global distributive duties as a remedial right, or as a remedial duty, I guess. So let's look at the past. Well, we could say in the past, developed countries have profited from the exploitation of poor countries. That is to say, justice requires us today to restore to them the damages that were wrought through colonialism or other kinds of empire building, right? Contemporary accounts of remedial rights might note that it's not just in the past that developed countries exploited underdeveloped countries, but it's also in the present. The contemporary international political and economic system unjustly, on their view, puts the interests of the rich and powerful before those of the poor and weak. And so justice requires today a reform of these unjust institutions and processes, right? Stopping rich countries from exploiting poorer countries. We could also view global distributive duties as primary rights, not just remedial rights, right? It might be the case that there are primary rights that people have currently that are being violated, right? So we look at negative rights. Well, citizens of poor countries are being unjustly interfered with by developed countries. They're being prevented from traveling, migrating, and contracting. Until these rights are remedied, developed countries owe them some compensation. On the positive right side, citizens of poor countries might be owed a decent standard of living, maybe even equal opportunities compared with those in developed countries. So this is a very strongly egalitarian sort of view. Since their states will not or cannot make these things happen, it falls on the developed world to do what they can, again, always within the limits of the possible, to make these rights real. So the idea is that there are many, many rights. Right, so on the negative right view, a negative right is a right against interference by others. The argument could be that currently developed countries are interfering with the negative rights of citizens in the developed world. They are preventing them from traveling, migrating, and contracting. And so either they have to remove these barriers or they have to compensate people for the inconvenience. Similarly, the positive rights, though, are generally rights to either particular goods or services, or rights to have things provided for you. So it's not just a negative right against interference, it's a positive right to certain goods. Now, citizens of poor countries might be owed certain things more than just non-interference, right? They might be owed rescue, they might be owed a decent standard of living, they might even be owed equal opportunities compared with those in developed countries. If you associate a very strong form of cosmopolitanism to positive rights, you get something like there really should be no difference between the opportunities of someone born in sub-Saharan Africa and someone born in the United States. But since the states of Central and Sub-Saharan Africa cannot make these things happen for them, it's going to fall on someone else to make it happen. Again, within the limits of the possible. No one's claiming that the world can be made perfect, only that there are some standards by which we should guide our actions in order to make things better. Okay, now the current international legal system, of course, does not have the teeth to force major powers like the United States, Russia, or China, or even countries in Western Europe, really, to live up to anything like the sorts of duties that philosophers are discussing. Those who endorse these rights, though, often campaign in favor of building such institutions, out of the belief that such duties are not just any moral duties, but they're duties that ought to be legally binding. Anything short of this fails to take the lives of people in the developing world seriously enough. Right? The idea is that people in the developed world simply aren't giving the appropriate moral weight to the survival and flourishing of people outside their borders. They're engaging in a kind of bigotry, a kind of discrimination based on national identity that is not permissible. There may be some permissible discrimination based on national identity. There might be some goods that need to be provided for citizens first, or there might be some privileges that can be afforded citizens, but that doesn't necessarily follow from that there are no duties to non-citizens, merely because there are strong duties towards citizens. So, again, people who are strong partisans of global distributive justice usually want to do more than just send money, ship money overseas, right? Or ship technology overseas, or know-how, or whatever their favorite form of helping is. They want to build international institutions that will actually use coercive power to impose these goals as a matter of justice, just as the domestic state would impose them on the domestic population if it were really a question of justice. I want to finish by talking about the Tobin Tax really quickly. This was a tax proposed by James Tobin, a Nobel laureate in economics, which would constitute a small tax on global currency transactions, right? So every time you change euros into dollars or dollars into yuan or what have you, a small tax would be levied on the order of 0 to 1% or 0.5 to 1%. And the idea that Tobin had was to penalize the kind of short-term currency speculation and short-term capital flows between countries that can sometimes destabilize particularly small emerging markets. And basically, it's a tax on those who want to make short-term financial profits by moving money around really quickly rather than invest for the long term in the real economies of those countries. Many people took this Tobin tax idea, many philosophers, many theorists of global justice have taken this sort of Tobin tax as a kind of tax that might begin to finance a set of global institutions concerned with both well-being and justice. Because if you take the proposal to build global institutions seriously, they've got to be financed somehow, right? And at least at a first pass, it looks like they have to be financed by the taxation systems of individual countries, right? It's not going to be the case that you can have a global IRS that's going to be capable of forcing the United States to surrender the tax revenue, some portion of its tax revenue of its citizens. In order to be able to tax, you have to have a threat of coercion, and without that threat of coercion, it's not clear what the tax is worth. It just seems like whoever wants to pay it will pay it, but then if it's voluntary, it's really not a tax. So, but if global institutions can start becoming financed, then they can start developing the capacity to do some arm twisting, right? So they might start doing things like, so you might transfer to them the regulation of the internet. You might transfer to them certain kinds of tasks that then make it harder for individual countries to say no to them, because nobody wants to get the internet turned off. Nobody wants to become an international trade pariah or what have you. But currently, there is no one institution that can really do that extensive amount of arm twisting, in part because those institutions depend on the goodwill of those countries, individual nation states, financing them. Okay, so that's all I have this week on distributive justice. Again, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch.